Paris had fallen. In the classrooms of the historic Sorbonne, the French language was no longer spoken. The books of Descartes, Voltaire, and Rousseau were quietly packed into wooden crates, replaced by administrative texts from the global south. Europe had become the colony. The wealth of the European continent was no longer staying in Europe. Instead, it flowed steadily south, across the Mediterranean, feeding the glittering, sprawling metropolises of a hyper-advanced African continent. For the first time in centuries, the Western world was not the center of global power. It was the periphery. How did the world turn upside down? How did the cradle of the Industrial Revolution become an occupied territory? To understand this alternate reality, we must look beyond the empires we know and ask a dangerous question. What if history chose a different winner? We are accustomed to a specific version of history. A history where European empires sailed the oceans, carved up continents, and established global dominance through industrial might and military force. But history is not a straight line. It is a fragile chain of events, decided by geography, climate, resources, and luck. Imagine a world where the dice rolled differently. A world where France never colonized Africa, but Africa colonized France instead. What would happen if the great empires of the African continent reached industrialization first? How would they govern a defeated Europe? Would French culture survive under decades of systematic assimilation? And would this inverted world order be any more peaceful than the one we live in today? Or would it merely repeat the same tragic cycles of exploitation and resistance? Every alternate history has a divergence point, a single moment where the path of humanity splits. In our timeline, the 14th century was disastrous for Europe. The Black Death wiped out nearly half the population, leaving the continent fractured, desperate, and starved.
But in this alternate timeline, the plague is even more devastating, leaving Europe in a state of perpetual dark ages, economic stagnation, and endless peasant revolts that last for 200 years.
Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the south, the African continent experiences a golden age of stability and innovation. The Mali Empire, blessed with vast gold reserves, does not see its wealth depleted or traded away. Under a succession of visionary rulers following Mansa Musa, the empire invests heavily in naval exploration, metallurgy, and domestic industries. Mali scholars at the University of Sankore in Timbuktu map the Atlantic current centuries ahead of their time. By the 15th century, West African shipbuilders have designed massive ocean-going vessels, vessels capable of defying the treacherous currents of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Further south, the Kingdom of Congo masters advanced iron-smelting on an industrial scale, creating a formidable domestic defense and trade network. In the north, the Moroccan and Algerian sultanates unify, forming a powerful maritime confederation that dominates Mediterranean trade. By the time the 17th century arrives, the balance of global power has completely shifted. Europe is a fractured jigsaw puzzle of war and impoverished kingdoms, depleted of resources and desperate for basic goods. Africa, on the other hand, is a network of wealthy, interconnected empires. They have the technology, the resources, and the capital. And as their populations grow, their merchants look across the Mediterranean toward a continent ripe for economic integration and eventual conquest. The colonization of France did not happen overnight. Like the European colonization of the real world, it began with trade, treaties, and debt. African merchant syndicates from Algiers, Dakar, and Benin first arrived on the southern coast of France as partners. They built trading posts in Marseille and Nice, offering loans to desperate French monarchs fighting local civil wars. But when those monarchs failed to pay back their debts, the African empires did not walk away. They demanded land, ports, and tax collecting rights as collateral. By the mid-18th century, the financial grip tightened into a military stranglehold. When the French king attempted to nationalize the foreign-owned ports, the African coalition declared war. It was an unequal conflict. The unified forces of the West African Imperium and the Mediterranean Sultanates possessed firearms of superior range and precision, along with highly organized professional standing armies. The French forces, relying on outdated mercenary tactics and fractured regional alliances, could not hold the line. The campaigns were brutal. The southern provinces fell within months. The invading armies marched north along the Rhone River, capturing Lyon and securing the agricultural heartlands of France. And then, in the autumn of 1789, the coalition armies surrounded Paris. The siege of Paris lasted for 40 days. With food cut off and the city bombarded by long-range artillery from the heights of Montmartre, the French government surrendered. The keys to the city were handed over to the military governors of the African coalition. The age of French sovereignty was over. The age of the Sine territory had begun. When an empire conquers a nation, it doesn't just take the land, it takes the mind. Just like European powers in our timeline justified their brutal conquest through the concept of the civilizing mission, the African administrators in occupied France believed they had a moral duty to elevate the unruly tribal natives of Europe.
To the administrators in Timbuktu and Algiers, France was a land of constant religious warfare, backward superstitions, and political instability. They believed the French people needed order, science, and true civilization. The colonial administration launched a sweeping cultural transformation,
erasing the old symbols of the conquered nation.
The French language was banned from official government buildings, courts, and prestigious schools. If a French citizen wanted to climb the social ladder or secure a job in the colonial bureaucracy, they had to master Swahili, Wolof, or the Northern Arabic dialects. Local traditions were patronized as quaint folk culture, suitable for museums, but unfit for the modern world. Historic cathedrals were converted into administrative centers or colonial academies. Street names were systematically changed to honor African generals and explorers. Even the names of regions were altered. Normandy and Brittany were merged into the administrative zone of Upper Gaul, boundaries drawn with absolute disregard for centuries-old regional rivalries. Generation by generation, the memory of an independent France began to fade. Young French citizens grew up learning the history of the great African empires, while their own history was reduced to a few brief, embarrassing chapters on medieval tribalism. But France was not the only prize. As the wealth of Europe became apparent, other African superpowers wanted their share of the northern continent. The competition grew so fierce that it threatened to spark a global war between the southern empires. To prevent this, the great powers convened a historic meeting, the Timbuktu Conference.
At this conference, without a single European representative in the room, the map of Europe was carved up like a piece of cake. The Iberian Peninsula in southern France fell under the control of the Moroccan-Algerian Union. Central France, Germany, and the Low Countries were claimed by the West African Imperium. The British Isles were occupied by maritime coalitions from the Gulf of Guinea. The East, including Italy and the Balkans, was divided among the Nile Valley powers and the East African trade federations. These borders were drawn with rulers and pencils, completely ignoring the ethnic, linguistic, and religious realities of the European peoples. Protestant regions were forced into the same administrative zones as Catholic ones. Historic enemies were locked inside the same colonial provinces, creating artificial internal tensions that the colonial governors expertly exploited. It was the classic strategy of divide and rule. By keeping the local populations fighting among themselves, the empires ensured that Europe would never unite to overthrow its masters. Colonialism is, at its heart, an economic machine.
and the machine built and occupied France was incredibly efficient. The resources of Europe were systematically extracted to fuel the industrial engines of the South. The coal mines of Lille and the iron ore of Lorraine were nationalized and handed over to state-backed African corporations.
The fertile valleys of southern France, famous for their vineyards, were converted into massive single-crop plantations designed to export grain, sugar beet, and timber back to the growing cities of the Sahel and North Africa.
French banks were dismantled. A new currency, pegged directly to the gold-backed standard of the African Central Bank in Timbuktu, was introduced. This system kept France in a state of perpetual economic dependency. The local population could not generate independent wealth. They could only survive as laborers, clerks, and low-level agricultural workers. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the African continent entered an era of unimaginable prosperity. Cities like Lagos, Algiers, Dakar, and Great Zimbabwe became the cultural and technological capitals of the earth. The universities of the South produced the world's leading scientists, doctors, and engineers. The standard of living skyrocketed.
But this utopia was built on a foundation of stolen labor, prompting young French citizens to migrate to Africa for menial jobs. In this reversed world order, desperate French migrants boarded crowded ships, crossing the Mediterranean in search of survival. Yet, history teaches us that no empire, no matter how powerful, can extinguish the human desire for self-determination. As the decades turned into centuries, underground networks like the Partisans of the Tricolor began to form in the shadows of occupied cities. In the forests of the Ardennes and the rugged mountains of the Massif Central, guerrilla fighters established secret bases to launch sabotage missions. In the cities, a silent cultural rebellion took hold as families gathered in secret basements to speak French and sing the forbidden national anthem. The colonial authorities responded with iron-fisted repression, establishing curfews, mass arrests, and constant surveillance. But the resistance could not be crushed, as every execution of a rebel leader only created more martyrs to fuel the fire. By the mid-20th century, the cost of counterinsurgencies became too high, and public opinion in Timbuktu began to shift.
Activists argued that colonialism was a moral stain that contradicted their own values, forcing the empires to withdraw. But independence did not bring peace. The departing administrators left behind a devastated continent and a completely broken French economy. Worse still, the artificial borders remained, and regional rivalries exploded into bloody civil wars across Europe. France found itself trapped in a cycle of political instability, relying on foreign aid from the very empires that had colonized them. This alternate history is a mirror, showing us that empire and exploitation are the recurring tragic patterns of human behavior when power is unbalanced. If the geographic and environmental cards had been dealt differently, the roles could have easily been reversed. This alternate reality is a reminder of how fragile our world is, and that the history we live in is simply the path we happen to take.